The Prime Minister there replying to pointed questions today on Canada's defence spending alongside his Polish counterpart, Donald Tusk, who said he expects all allies to meet NATO's target sooner rather than later. The questions to the Prime Minister follow a rare public scolding of sorts from NATO officials last week, including the head of that alliance on this program, who said he expects Canada to set out an outline to reach 2% of GDP on defence spending. So what's behind the public calling out, and what might it mean for Canada's reputation among our allies? With me now to unpack all of that is Ivo Daalder, former United States ambassador to NATO during the Obama administration, and retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie, former commander of the Canadian Army and former Liberal MP. Hello to both of you. Thank you so much for making the time. Ambassador, I'll start with you. What do you think informs the very public way with which people from NATO, including the current U.S. ambassador to NATO, has started to call Canada out for its failure to set out a plan to reach 2%?
Well, a very simple thing. In 2014, NATO leaders agreed in Wales after the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine that NATO would aim, that every country that wasn't spending 2% of GDP on defense would aim to do so by 2024. Well, it's 2024. And a year ago, NATO agreed that 2% was a floor and not a ceiling. So it is incumbent on those countries that are not spending what they have committed to spend to lay out a plan to figure out how to get there. And this has been an issue for a long time. This is not something that's just come up. Barack Obama came to Ottawa to spoke to Parliament and mentioned the fact that it's time for Canada to do more. We need more Canada, he said at the time. We do. And in fact, I think as NATO does more, one of its most important allies, Canada, needs to do more as well. I think that's all people are saying.
Despite the former president's remarks, and I know you'll remember them, General Leslie, like I did, they made some waves when he made that address in the House of Commons. There have been increases to defense spending, but still specifically never an explicit commitment to reach 2% of GDP on defense spending by a certain year. Why do you think that is?
I don't think that the current government has any intention of spending 2%. And though the Prime Minister, in his announcement, when he was trying to defend himself, said, well, Canada is committed to achieving a 70% increase, nothing's really happened in comparison to 2015. So we've got a war, an active, high-intensity war, extraordinarily sanguinary, happening in poor Ukraine. Canada, which is a $2 trillion economy, is less than 1.27% GDP. And let's just take a look at the numbers. That means we're fourth from the bottom out of 31 NATO countries. And by the way, Ambassador, you may not be aware of this, but just recently, the Department of National Defense, for 2 years in a row, has handed in, unspent, reprofiled, lapsed $4 billion. That was meant for equipment. And the cumulative total since 2015, since this government came to power, is $20 billion. To Canada, that's a lot of money.
Yes, it is a lot of money, Ambassador, and I think that's part of where the lack of political will, not just of this government, but of the previous government as well, kind of comes through. I think, there's some outside analysis that has been done to say if we did that over the next 4 years, trying to reach the NATO target, it would be an extra $10 to $15 billion a year. If the concern is the fiscal impact of that, what would you say to those concerns?
Well, it's not up to me to tell the Canadian people or the government how to figure out to meet its obligations. It is up to me to remind all Canadians that being a member of NATO not only comes with incredible benefits, it becomes with security, with having strong allies and partners who are there with you, not just to defend you if the need arises. And as things heat up in every possible way, climate and otherwise, in the Arctic, now all nations in the Arctic except for Russia are NATO members. Canada is a big Arctic nation, and in being part of NATO should help in the future. But with all those great benefits come certain responsibilities. And one of those responsibilities is to contribute, and to contribute a fair share. And NATO decided, for reasons that we can go back to and we might even debate, but they did decide, and it did so with consensus, that at a minimum, that's 2% of GDP. And it isn't, frankly, too much to ask any country or any government to spend on defense, because doing so enhances the common capacity of everyone to meet the security, not to defend themselves in case of war, but actually to deter it in the first place. And by that measure, 2% is a cheap contribution. And then finally, as I think the Prime Minister said himself, this is not the same world as 2015. Frankly, it's not even the same world as early 2022. We are faced with a hot war, the first major hot war since World War II, and Canada will remember better than most what it means to fight a hot war in Europe. It's not something that anyone wants to do, and the way to prevent it is for an alliance to be strong, and for an alliance to be strong is for everybody to do their part.
When you talk to some of the people on the inside of government, General Leslie, who are tasked with making these kinds of decisions, they refer to our geography, right? The fact that exactly what the ambassador just laid out, the threat posed by Russia in this instance, but particularly the threat felt by European countries because of geography perhaps isn't felt to the same degree here. How would you address that?
Well, the whole idea is essentially collective defense. So what happens overseas can and will have an impact that happens here. Canada has long had a certain degree of assumed smugness in its defense spending when it hasn't been a world war, because we knew we could always rely on the United States to defend us if we couldn't be bothered to do it ourselves. Let me give you some numbers. So in our pristine Arctic, Canada currently has about 300 members of the Canadian Armed Forces stationed there full-time or part-time. The United States has about 22,600 highly trained with all sorts of suites of equipment. Russia is somewhere near 45,000. Russia and the United States are our neighbors. Be careful. China is building more icebreakers than we dream of. Russia has many, many, many icebreakers to our paltry 3 or 4. We have to pull our fair share of the burden of collective defense, because it just may be possible that a future U.S. president will not treat Canada well should we not reach our 2%, which we promised to do so in 2014. And one of the candidates for the presidency has now not stated once or twice, but multiple times, what his intention are for those people who are laggards. We don't do it because of threats. We do it because it's the right thing to do. And collectively, to a $2 trillion economy, another $15 to $20 billion, though of course people like to see it spent elsewhere, it has to be spent on defense because we owe it to our friends and allies so that they'll help us should we run into trouble.
Ambassador, last question to you. Was it your sense during your time at NATO that Canada did feel like it could defer to the U.S. to protect us if necessary? And do you feel that informs some of the dialogue today?
I think when I was at NATO, that was from 2009 to 2013, was a different government, by the way, in one that was not always as friendly to NATO as the current government, I must say, certainly not when it comes to the High North. But I think there was a general sense that paying a lot for defense, let alone for NATO, was not something that Canada was particularly interested in. I think it's been true not just for this government, but for previous governments as well. I do want to emphasize the point that General Leslie is making. When I was in Europe just a couple of weeks ago at the Munich Security Conference, I was struck by the growing worriness and wariness in Europe about what is happening in the United States, one I share. We are faced for the first time in 75 years with the possibility that the United States will not be there when it comes to defending its allies, whether in Europe or indeed in Canada. And I think the Europeans are waking up to that reality and starting to seriously invest and think about what does their responsibility require. I think the time has come for Canada to be part of that conversation because Canada is committed to NATO. It doesn't have the kind of problems that the United States has with its internal politics. And it makes it all the more important that Canada does what it can do, which is to be, once again, that great ally of our Europeans and of the United States that it has been for so very long and has demonstrated through 2 world wars by fighting on the continent.
Okay, on that note, I'll leave it. I appreciate very much both of you making the time for the discussion. That's the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder, and the former commander of the Canadian Army and former Liberal MP, retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie. Thank you to both of you.